can end with the...
So we wrote an editorial this month. It's the first time in 19 years that I've continued an editorial to a different page because I couldn't cut anything out of it because it needed to be said. This town of Andover, their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee decided that they didn't want to be inclusive or diverse or equitable anymore. They want to cancel Columbus Day, and in replacing Columbus Day, they want to make it Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, what is this really all about? This is just an attack on white people is what this really is. Columbus Day was a day that was set aside for Italian Americans after Italian Americans were treated so horribly when they first came to this country. Some of them were lynched. Some of them were murdered. We detailed one of the situations that led up to Columbus Day becoming Columbus Day. We gave people a nice little history lesson that is actually true. You can Google it. You can look it up. There's nothing made up in that. And the fact is, indigenous people aren't indigenous to the United States. I don't know why we keep calling them indigenous people. Anybody who studies like 5th grade history knows that the so-called indigenous people, the Indians, came across the Bering Strait from Russia to this continent. And then when the seas rose, the Bering Strait Bridge was no longer. There was a land bridge, and the bridge was no longer when the seas rose. And they ended up getting stuck on the continent, not being able to get back to their original continent. So they're not indigenous to this country. But in America today, we have to call everything what it's not, because it's all about how people feel. So we're going to call them indigenous people. I'm all for having an Indigenous People Day. I don't like the name because it's not accurate. I'm for having a day for the Indians. And I don't care what you want to call it. You want to call it Indigenous People Day, I'm fine with that. But there's 364 other days that you could pick to honor indigenous people. And I think that and I don't have I think it's August 9th. I could be wrong on the exact date, but I know it's in August. The UN, about 15, 20 years ago, has already established an Indigenous People Day worldwide, and I think it's August 9th. Do it August 9th. Do it August 10th. Do it any of the other 364 days but Columbus Day. If this was really about helping indigenous people get recognized, and they should be recognized, then why would they be trying to replace Columbus Day with this rather than just finding another day? Here's why. Because today's racist fascists on the left attack white people and think that it's okay to attack white people. They've completely shit on Martin Luther King's dream that we all get treated the same. They don't want to treat everyone the same. They don't want to treat everyone equally. They want revenge for what previous white people did, who are now dead, that aren't even around anymore. And they want to somehow get them back. They want to somehow show today's white people how it felt to be an indigenous person or a black person or some other kind of person. But when Italian Americans came to this country, they were considered the N-words of the Europeans. And they were often called the N-words of the European only. They didn't say N-word back then, all right? And they were treated horribly by the Germans who were already here. They were treated horribly by the English who were already here. They were lynched, and there's tons of evidence of it. And in order to try and welcome Italian Americans as Americans to this country, we formed Columbus Day to honor the contribution of Italian Americans, who, by the way, were an ethnic minority. They just were. I know today everybody who's white is considered privileged, but white people, to me, white people is a slur. There's various different ethnic groups. There's Australian, there's Spaniards, there's Germans, there's Austrians. They all have very different cultures. They all have very different pigments of skin. And by the way, there's racism among all of them. They all have racist views of all of the other groups. Racism has existed since the dawn of man. It will continue to exist until the last man takes his last breath on earth, because it's the human condition. It's just what it is. When I grew up in Lawrence, and I know we got something to get to, but when I grew up in Lawrence, the Italians and the Irish hated each other. In fact, my aunt who raised me, my mom, was Irish. She married an Italian in Cropra. Some members of the family took a long time to even speak to my uncle because he was a dirty Italian. And families split up over these kinds of things when I was growing up. And there was all kinds of racism among white people for other white people. So now that all these white people are all being lumped in together today, and Italians are considered the same as like the English who came here and actually owned slaves, I look back and I see that the Italian Americans back then were against the Jim Crow laws. The Italian Americans back then were for civil rights for black people. And yet you're going to treat them the same as the Englishmen who owned the slaves and tortured slaves. That just shows an ignorance of history, and it shows a hate for a group of people at a time that you're pretending in your diversity, equity, and inclusion club that you have, pretending that you're doing something for the right reason against racism when you're really just being racist yourself. So I'm going to end with that because we